Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Maura Thomas. Maura is an award-winning international speaker, trainer, and author. She is the most widely cited authority on attention management and helps driven, motivated knowledge workers like you control your attention and regain control over the details of your life and work. Her new book is Attention Management: How to Create Success and Gain Productivity Every Day. In it, she reveals how to effectively manage your attention, not your time. And today, she is our Modern Leadership guest expert. Maura, it's so great to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm great. It's happy to be here, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Holy smokes. International speaker, trainer, author. You're doing so much. We're going to get into all of that. But before we do, give us a little background, a little personal. Who is Maura?
Well, thanks for asking. I grew up in the productivity industry. My first job out of college was for a company that sold paper-based planners, and I worked there for 10 years. And then I left there, started my business. I got a really great education in all things productivity because it was my job to know not only what our company was selling and why it was important, but what everybody else was doing as well. So I got to go to every training, and I had to read every book, and I saw every speaker, and I learned pretty much every productivity system that was around. And so then I was able to pick and choose the best of what I had learned when I started my business and roll it up into the system I teach now, which is called Empowered Productivity, because it's about putting you back in the driver's seat of your life and your work.
And I bet there's a bunch of people listening right now that are thinking, wow, what a dream job. What an opportunity to grow and develop and to be paid to learn some of this stuff that I'm frankly obsessed with. I love it. So tell me, before we jump into kind of what you're doing today, I want to hear about how the training and also this productivity, this time management has changed from the time that you were working with this company until now. What shifts have you seen?
Well, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but when I got out of college and entered the work world in the, early 90s, it was, people were still using paper-based planners, and life was a lot less complicated because there wasn't a ton. I mean, email was around and the internet was around, but there wasn't a ton of it. And we had no internet connected smartphones, or they were just, I don't even think we had them back then.
Yeah, not in the early 90s. We didn't even have cell phones really, unless it was that big brick that you carried around in a suitcase.
In a bag, right? In your car, yeah. Yeah, so paper-based planners were all the rage and still really enough. And time management was enough, because when I ask people what it means, well, let me ask you, Jake, what does managing time, how do you specifically manage time? What does that mean exactly? What is the thing you do to manage time?
You know, I love having you on the podcast because I am horrible at this, but I am a list maker. And my wife rolls her eyes at me because she walks into my office and I have a paper list. I have an Asana task list. I have emails that send to me throughout the day that say, remember to do this. I am horrible at this, but that's part of my system is just all of these lists.
Okay, lists. What else? What else do you do to manage time?
I live and die by the calendar. Everything is on the calendar, and I'm to the minute with my calendar. I have a reminder that comes at 15, a reminder that comes at 10. I have the smart watch that says, hey, Jake, your call with Maura is in 10 minutes. Start setting up the microphone, things like that.
And that's exactly it. For most people, managing time means making an appointment with yourself on your calendar. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right.
And so in the 90s, before the advent of smartphones and internet connected devices and a million different communication channels and offices with walls and doors, right? Back then, that worked. You could make an appointment with yourself. You could close your office door. You could put your desk phone on do not disturb, and you could work from your calendar. But those days are gone. And so you asked me what has changed. That's really what's changed. Managing time. I mean, who's the first person you are going to break an appointment with, Jake?
Well, it's the only person that I would break an appointment with because, come hell or high water, I'm not missing this call with you. But if I have scheduled, an hour to do some deep work at, as soon as this was over and something came up, yeah, I'd be the only person I'd break that time with.
We are the first person we're going to break an appointment with. And so, or the only person. And so managing time doesn't help that much, right? Making an appointment with yourself on your calendar doesn't help that much. So that's, when it comes to time management, that's sort of the specific technique. But when we think about that phrase, time management, I really think it holds us back because you can't manage time. Aside from that specific thing that you do, which is make an appointment with yourself on your calendar, which really doesn't work a lot of the time, time management gives us this impression that we have some sort of control over time. And of course we don't. You can't slow it down. You can't get more of it. You can't back it up. You can't bend it to your will in any way. You can't manage time. And so what's changed is the world and the way that we sort of manage our lives in this changing world. And so I think we really need to stop talking about managing time. And I mean, making an appointment with yourself on your calendar, if you use it judiciously and occasionally, I believe, it's okay, right? You have a big deadline due tomorrow. You might want to leave some time today to make sure that all your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed, right? Sure, that's fine. But you personally, I believe, now there is a whole world in time management of schedulers, right? There are those heavy schedulers who like you, rely exclusively on their calendar, and they schedule every single thing, and every minute of their calendar is booked, and there are some tools that auto scheduling tools to use. Personally, I don't think that, in my experience with my clients and with myself, that has not been super effective, but it's out there.
And I would reiterate that point from my experience as well. I do a lot of coaching, and almost to the person, every single person that I talk to that does time blocking or tries to manage time through their calendar finds that it's not as successful as they need it to be. They're very good at being there for other people, at showing up for the things that other people are relying on them for. But it's when you say, I have a deadline tomorrow and I need to dot I's and cross T's today, so I'm going to block out 2 hours from 1 to 3 today, something inevitably comes up. We become reactionary to whatever fire we're facing, and that hour gets truncated. Perfect example, and I see where this conversation is going because we got to get into this attention management. Yesterday, I had a presentation that I was giving last night, and I needed to put the final touches on the slideshow. So I blocked off time yesterday to kind of update. The slideshow was pretty much created, but I wanted to spend some time tweaking it a little bit. Well, guess what? The day came upon me, and I ended up giving the presentation without making very many changes to the slideshow because the time that I had blocked got eaten into. So now let's take this and go, okay, there's got to be a better way, Maura. Help us.
How you manage your time doesn't matter if you are distracted every few minutes during that time. So even if, Jake, you managed to do that, you blocked out 1 to 3 to put those finishing touches on your presentation, and then 1 o'clock rolled around and you pulled up the presentation and you started to look at it, and then the phone rang. And so you answered it. And then, okay, where was I? The presentation. Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to, oh, wait, look, there's an email. Okay, who's that from? Right? Yeah. Okay. Nope. Back to the presentation. And, oh, I just got a text message, right? if you spent the time that you quote unquote managed on your calendar to do that presentation, even if the presentation was open on the screen in front of you for the entire 2 hours, but you only gave your attention to that presentation in 2-minute increments as you dealt with the phone call and the text message and the new email and the person who interrupted you and all the other stuff, then at the end of that time that you blocked, your presentation probably still wouldn't be done. And even worse, what did I just do? Because I wasn't really paying attention. And now I have to go back and see if there's any typos or if I screwed anything up because I wasn't really focused on it. So the bottom line is that how you manage your time only matters to the extent that you also devote your attention.
And this is the myth of the multitasker, where we think we can do multiple things at once, and that's absolutely a myth.
Absolutely. And, this is a thing that I'm turning over in my head to write about. I think it might be my next HBR article or something. But distraction and multitasking are almost exactly the same thing, because multitasking isn't really doing two things at once. Multitasking is switching between those two. So not doing two things at exactly the same time, but having two or more things sort of open and in process as you switch among them. And doesn't that to you sound exactly like distraction?
Yeah. And I was reading a book just yesterday that gave an example I think goes right along with what you're saying. And that is, if you're ever driving in traffic and you're driving, you're talking with the person sitting next to you, and then you need to, make a maneuver, like maybe there's two big trucks on the freeway and you're going to drive between them, you will naturally stop talking, and put your attention. And the interesting thing is the person that you're talking to, maybe it's their turn to talk. They will naturally stop talking because they can feel this tension, this environment where you're trying to make a move. And that's where we can't drive and talk at the same time in that same way.
Exactly right. You're switching. When you're driving and talking on the phone, you're switching between the road and the conversation. And that's why it's so dangerous, because when our head is in the conversation, the basal ganglia part of our brain, the part that handles sort of automatic functions, right? I've driven a million times. I've driven this road a million times. I know exactly where I'm going. I don't need to think about driving. I don't need to think about where I'm headed because it's all very familiar. So I'm going to go on autopilot. So really the conscious part of my brain is not driving. The autopilot part of my brain is driving. But the autopilot part can't help us when something when something changes rapidly.
Out of the ordinary or out of what is expected.
That's right. And so that's why driving and talking on the phone is so dangerous, because it is not doing two things at once. It is switching. Your conscious brain is switching between the two. And so managing your time doesn't matter. Also, the reason that managing time doesn't matter is because time isn't our problem. Every single person who has ever walked the face of the planet has had the same 24 hours that you and I get in a day. And so not enough time is not our problem. Distraction is our problem. And you can't solve a distraction problem with a time solution. You have to solve a distraction problem with an attention solution. So I would suggest to your listeners to stop worrying about time management and start instead thinking about how you manage your attention. And I think that that perspective switch will help you.
Well, let's dive into it a little bit. Give us some tools or some ways that we can be better at managing our attention. Now, obviously, we'll send the audience over to pick up a copy of your book to jump into all of these strategies that you've researched and outlined. But before we get to that, walk us through just a couple that we can start implementing immediately. What's something I can do today to help better manage my attention?
Is there anything you do, Jake, that you do without thinking? Any sort of habit that you engage in that you don't even realize you're doing it? Do you bite your cheek or bite your nails or crack your knuckles or do any of those things?
Oh, I'm sure that I have plenty of those. I don't bite my cheek or bite my nails, but my wife is constantly saying that I'm tapping things. Like when I'm driving in the car, I'm always tapping on the gear shifter, or something like that. And she always grabs my hand and says, "Stop tapping."
And you didn't even realize you did it, right?
Right.
And so I would imagine that it's easier for you to not do that when you are in the presence of your wife, because she's going to stop you. She's going to call your attention to the fact that you're doing it, and she's going to stop you.
Yeah, it's certainly because it's on my attention. I don't think it's as habitual because I'm putting my attention saying, oh, I know that I normally do this. My wife has mentioned it for 16 years. Okay, I better stop doing this.
Right. And so it's very difficult to change a habit that you don't know you have. And so the number one thing that I would suggest your listeners do in order to regain control over their attention is to recognize that for most of us, distraction is a habit. When you are at work all day long and you get interrupted by something every 2 minutes, you are distracted every 2 minutes. And so distraction becomes a habit, and it's a habit that gets reinforced every 2 minutes. And so it becomes a really strong habit. But most of us don't recognize distraction as a habit. And until you recognize your habit, you can't change it.
You know, this is really interesting because we often, and I've thought about this ever since the computer became mainstream, where computers, operate on ones and zeros, and it's either a one or it's a zero. And I think since that time, we as a society have become much more ones and zeros, when it comes to politics, when it comes to right and wrong, when it comes to orientation, all these things that we talk about, our minds naturally go along this same computer, ones and zeros. And when you talk about that and you say, habits, I immediately went to ones and zeros. I said, it's either a good habit or it's a bad habit. But there are these things that are kind of in between that are maybe they're productivity distractions. Maybe they're pulling us away from productivity, but we don't naturally associate them with bad habits. For example, I check my email every 2 minutes. If I don't take the time to intentionally say, hey, this is distracting me, I may not say checking my email is a bad habit.
You're sort of alluding to a section of my book, Attention Management, where I sort of simplify our sort of brain activity into 4 quadrants. And the axes are how much attention you are giving something and how much effort it takes you. And to your point about good versus bad, sometimes we need to be in that headspace where we can rapidly switch between things, where we do need to sort of put out fires and sort of assess a million different things and make quick decisions and rapidly switch from one thing to another. I call that quadrant reactive and distracted. It's not always bad. But for most of us, unless you're, sort of a first responder or an emergency room doctor or something, for most of us who sit at a desk to do our work, there aren't a lot of, crazy life-threatening emergencies coming at us. We don't need that reactive and distracted quadrant all that often. And yet that's typically the quadrant that most of us are in all day long.
And do you think that's because we're hardwired that way from the days of the caveman, fight or flight? It's, being responsive. Or do you think we've become conditioned to this by the fact that we have smartphones that are being in our pocket and smart watches that tell us every 10 minutes we've got something new happening?
That's exactly it. We've become habituated because even in caveman days, fight or flight was a specific sometime response. It wasn't the state that a caveman lived in all the time, right? But it is the state that we sort of live in all the time because we are heightened. We are stressed at work. We are switching constantly. It makes us feel frazzled and flustered and forgetful. And so it heightens our stress. And so we end up in this stress state for most of our days. If you ever come home from work and you feel like you need a little bit of time to sort of unwind and kind of let the stress of the day go, most of my clients feel like they don't want anybody to talk to them when they first walk through the door after getting home from work at night. That's because we live in this heightened stress state at work. And, it's various levels of it. It could be just a little bit, and sometimes it's really a lot. But the point is that it is that heightened stress state. But to your point, we have become habituated to this distraction. And so even in the absence of distraction, we seek out the distraction because we're so used to expecting one every couple of minutes. And so we distract ourselves because we are habituated to distraction. So it's such an important thing to recognize distraction as a habit, because you can't change a habit that you don't know you have. And in changing any habit, awareness and even awareness training is the first step.
So one of the thoughts that I have as you talk through this is maybe carrying around a little notepad and recognizing maybe over the next week, every time I get distracted, and then making a little note of the email distracted me, the plane flying over my house distracted me, the whatever it may be, the ringing of the phone distracted me. Would that be a good exercise?
It would. That's a great example of awareness training. And when you can recognize, if not only make a note that you got distracted, but you're right, what was it that distracted you? And so then you can sort of have a blueprint to say, all right, now how can I change this so that these things don't distract me when I don't want to be distracted? If I need those undistracted 2 hours so that I can put my whole head into this presentation that I have to do tomorrow and make sure these slides are everything I want them to be, here are all the ways that I get distracted in a day. So how can I prepare myself for this, work session? I also would suggest 2 hours is a little bit too long, because you might get distracted by, oh, my neck hurts from sitting here like this, or, oh, I need some water, or I need to use the restroom, or whatever. I would say probably about 75 minutes. But now you have this blueprint. These are all the ways I can get distracted. So before I go into the 75-minute work session, how can I make sure that none of these things happen? Okay, I can put on headphones so that the plane doesn't distract me. I can close out my email so that doesn't distract me. I can put my phone on Do Not Disturb so that doesn't buzz and my watch doesn't buzz. I can close my office door or I can put a Do Not Disturb sign up so that my coworkers don't interrupt me, right? You can get ready for it because you know what distracts you typically.
And I think this is an absolutely tremendous step for us each to take. It's something small that we can start doing today. I mean, as soon as we turn off this episode of the podcast, we can start putting this into play. But I believe that this is going to take us a little bit, right? This isn't something like a light switch that we can turn off and on, but this is something that we're going to have to practice and get better at. And we can't beat ourselves up if today we're not perfect at managing our attention.
Absolutely. It's like any other habit. If you are trying to stop tapping, you're not going to go cold turkey probably. You're not going to be able to say, I will never tap again. And it will, right? It's just not going to happen that way. We become aware of it. And as we become aware of it, we start to recognize when we're doing it. And then when we recognize that we're going to do it, then sometimes we can recognize the cues that make us want to do it. And then once we recognize the cues, then we can interrupt the cue. And we can start to change the behavior. So it happens absolutely over time.
Well, we just started to scratch the surface of what you've got in this great attention management book, and we're going to send all the listeners over to pick up a copy and to go deeper into this, to take what we started with today, which is the very surface level, and start to move deeper. But alas, at this point, it's time for us to switch gears in the podcast and go to a section I love called Learning from Leaders, find out a little bit more about you. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. Our first question then, is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading these days?
Right now I'm reading Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Again, I read it years ago and learned so much from it. And it's just been coming up for me a lot lately. And I was like, I really need to refresh myself about that book. It's really useful about sort of the two systems of our brain, the one that's sort of automatic that responds to stimuli, and fast thinking, and slow thinking, which is sort of the deliberative, contemplative practice that most of us are squeezing out because we're doing too much fast thinking and not enough slow thinking these days. It's a great book.
It's very interesting because 2 days ago I had a copy of that book on my iPhone. I listen in the car on Audible, and I could only get through about the first hour, and I had to turn it off and then I turned on Daniel Pink's To Sell Is Human, and I couldn't turn it. I mean, it was just amazing, and I finished it within 2 days. And I think it's interesting that, the book that you are reading right now and just love is something I really couldn't get into. And I think that's kind of interesting as we look at different personalities.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to read a lot of, how does your brain work books, and they tend to be a little bit dense and sometimes a little heavy and hard to get through. I tend to read in small chunks.
Great idea. All right. Our second question is your leadership superpower.
Oh, this is a tough one. I think it's listening. I love that expression that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think the older we get, the older I get, the more I realize how beneficial it is to do more listening and less talking, and also real what some people call transformative listening, which is about listening and making sure that you really understand what the other person is saying. So I do a lot of mirroring. I think I heard you say XYZ. Would you agree? Is that right? So I think it's super helpful.
Yeah, listening to hear and not listening to respond. I love that. What a great superpower. Our next question is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra that you live by.
Ever since I was young, I haven't found one that resonates more for me than the expression that says, don't wait for your ship to come in, swim out to it.
Which is so important. Tell us why that's been important in your life.
I'm just really a believer in action. I think action is the antidote to anxiety and to worry and to fear. And I think that sitting around and waiting for what you want is just sort of a waste of time. I think we all need to ask for what we want. One of the books that probably had the biggest impact on me when I was younger was Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins. And a big theme in that is ask for what you want. Ask. If you don't get it, change your approach, ask again. And if you don't get it, change your approach, ask again. And I just think that is such good advice. And I think it's really well summed up in that expression about swimming out to your boat, your ship.
Yeah, and we're big believers around here that immediate, imperfect action beats inaction every time. Just move forward and adjust and adapt and move forward. All right, our final question then today is the book that you most often gift or refer to friends, family, and colleagues.
This one is a little bit sort of outside the business realm, but it's called The Gift of Fear. And it is, and the author's name, he's been Gavin DeBecker is the author. And it's about how it reads like a thriller, because he is a security expert, and he talks about how people who have been victims of crime will always start their story to him by saying, this person it just seemed so normal, and there was nothing to predict that this was going to happen. And then as they get into their story, there's always this moment in the story where they say something like, and I thought that was a little weird, or, and I got a weird feeling about that, or I thought I was surprised when that happened, or something. And that's the moment that he pulls out and he says, look, that is your fear response telling you this is not right. And we tend to suppress that, and we need to listen to that.
I think that's an interesting thought. I haven't read that book, but it's something that intrigues me. I've put it now on my bookshelf because I want to jump into that, because I agree with you that I was having this conversation last night, and I was saying I'm not a super great judge of character. I like everybody. And so when I meet somebody, I immediately trust them. I feel like I know them. I like them. I trust them. I want to do business with them. And that's not always good. And we got into this conversation about, Bernie Madoff and how many people knew, like, and trusted him, and Ted Bundy and how many people knew, like, and trusted him. And the fact that not everybody has these great intentions. You got to listen to these little triggers within you that say, hey, Jake, maybe you need to look a little deeper in this before proceeding, headlong into this relationship.
Absolutely. It's a great great book, and it has so many applications, not the least of which is to keep us safe.
Maura, at the end of this podcast, before we let you go, and thank you for coming on and being such a great expert, before we let you go, how can we pick up a copy of Attention Management, and how can we find out more about you?
Thanks for asking. My website is maurathomas.com, and you can find all of my books there. Also, the direct website for the book is attentionmanagementbook.com.
Again, thank you for coming on, helping us become better managers of our attention, not our time. Thank you for being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
Attention management. I love this concept. You know, for years, I've been trying to manage my time. I'm one of these guys that use the Franklin Covey planner. I'm one of these guys, as I mentioned in the show, that has all of these software applications that I'm using to list my tasks and check them off and be productive, turning off my emails so that I'm not distracted. I'm constantly trying to manage my time, and I'm not succeeding. I'm better at it, and I'm more productive now than I ever have been, but I'm not to the level that I want to be. And so I love jumping into this topic of attention management, figuring out what my distractions are, what my habitual distractions are, and finding ways to put in place steps so that I'm not distracted when I need to get that deep work done, when I need to get that important work done, when I set this time schedule with myself to make sure that I use it appropriately. I love this topic, and of course, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes, including the quote, the book, and how to connect with Maura. Everything is over at jakeacarlson.com/ML168, episode 168. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything, even attention management, is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.